A billionaire pointed at a black woman in first class and said there had been a mistake. 2 hours later, he was unconscious. She was the only thing keeping him alive. This is one of those black stories that starts in silence and ends with the whole world watching. JFK Airport, Tuesday morning, 6:42 a.m. The American Airlines flagship First Lounge sat on the upper level of Terminal 8, separated from the rest of the airport by a frosted glass wall and a quiet that felt almost deliberate. The carpet was thick, the lighting was low and warm. A row of leather chairs faced floor-to-ceiling windows where the tarmac stretched out into a pale gray sky that hadn't fully decided whether it was morning yet. The lounge held maybe 30 people. A man in his 50s with a Dallas Cowboys lanyard typed without looking up from his laptop. Two women in matching blazers reviewed a presentation on a shared screen, pointing and whispering. A silver-haired executive sipped a Bloody Mary and stared at nothing. Everyone carried the particular stillness of people who traveled this way often enough to stop being impressed by it. Naomi Bennett walked in at 6:42, and nobody looked up. She was 44 with deep brown skin and natural curls pinned back in a way that was neat without being stiff. Her navy blazer was well fitted and had one small pin near the lapel, the seal of a Los Angeles hospital system, the kind of detail that meant something to people who knew what it meant. She wore thin silver-framed glasses and carried a paper coffee cup in one hand and a worn leather bag in the other. The bag had a logo embossed near the clasp. Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Department of Neurology. She set it down beside a window seat, settled in without ceremony, and pulled a journal from the bag. The cover read, Cerebrovascular Disease Advanced Clinical Practice 8th Edition. She opened it to a page that was already marked with a folded sticky note and began to read. Her boarding pass was tucked between the pages. Seat 2, A First Class, JFK to LAX. She had taken this flight 41 times. Naomi was heading to Los Angeles for a medical conference, not to attend, not to present a panel. She was the keynote. She had been invited to open the National Neurological Sciences Conference with a talk she had spent 3 months refining a 70-minute address on emergency stroke intervention in non-clinical environments. She had given versions of this talk before to rooms full of neurologists, hospital administrators, emergency medicine directors. She would give it again in less than 30 hours. But right now, she was drinking airport coffee and reading a journal she had already read twice because that was the kind of person she was. She did not need a stage to feel like herself. She felt like herself in a chair by a window at 6:42 in the morning, with bad coffee and a worn book in a lounge full of people who didn't know her name. She was used to that. Victor Zhao arrived at 6:58. His entrance was not quiet, not because he was loud. He was not loud. He was the kind of man whose presence arranged itself ahead of him, a subtle displacement of air and attention that came from years of walking into rooms and having every room respond. He was 63 with silver at his temples and a face that was still sharp, still angular, the kind of face that photographed well and aged well and was aware of both facts. His suit was Italian, charcoal gray with a faint texture that only became visible in direct light. His watch was a Patek Philippe with a blue dial. His carry-on was a Rimowa aluminum case that caught the lounge lighting as he wheeled it in. He had 2 assistants with him, a young man in a dark blazer who carried a second bag and moved 3 steps behind, and a woman in her 30s who was speaking quietly into a wireless earpiece while scrolling something on a tablet. Both of them moved with the practiced efficiency of people whose entire job was anticipating a single person's next need. Victor's phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced at it, answered without breaking stride, and had a 12-second conversation in Mandarin that ended with him pressing end and handing the phone to the young man without looking at him. The young man took it and noted something on his own phone. Victor's assistant, the woman with the earpiece, confirmed his boarding pass. At the lounge desk, confirmed his seat assignment, confirmed his upgrade to first class, and relayed all of this to him in a voice just above a murmur. He nodded once. She gestured toward the far end of the lounge. He scanned the room in the way people do when they are checking whether a space meets their standards. His eyes moved across the leather chairs, the breakfast buffet, the view of the tarmac. They moved across Naomi. They stopped for less than a second. Then they moved on. But the assistant noticed. The assistant always noticed. He leaned close and said something softly. Victor's expression did not change. He touched his watch once with his left thumb, a small private gesture, and looked out the window. He said nothing. Not yet. 40 minutes later, the gate opened for boarding. Naomi closed her journal, slipped it into her bag, and stood. She rolled her shoulders, once the way a person does when they have been still too long. She picked up her coffee, found it cold, drank the last of it anyway, and dropped the cup in a bin near the door. She walked to the gate without hurrying. She had learned long ago that first class boards first and waits longest. She had learned a great many things the long way. The cabin was exactly what it always was. 6 rows, 12 seats, white linen headrest covers with a small gold logo, soft overhead lighting at the temperature of late afternoon, a faint smell of fresh coffee coming from the galley. Naomi settled into 2A, the window seat in the first row, and pulled her journal out before the second passenger in her row had boarded. She did not look up when the footsteps came. She felt the pause before she heard it. A stillness at the threshold of the row, the particular hesitation of someone who has seen something unexpected and is deciding how to respond to it. She turned one page, then another. Victor Zhao stood at row 2 and looked at seat 2A. Then he looked at the seat number on the overhead panel. Then he looked at the flight attendant who was moving up the aisle toward him. The flight attendant was Olivia Hart, 37, with auburn hair pulled back and a practiced composure that had been tested on thousands of flights and had not broken yet. She saw the pause. She understood the pause. She had seen this pause before. She smiled and said, "Can I help you find your seat?" Victor looked at her with the even expression of a man who was about to be reasonable. "Excuse me," he said. He kept his voice low and pleasant, the voice of someone who had learned that you caught more cooperation with courtesy. "I think there may be some kind of seating error here." Olivia held out her hand for his boarding pass. He gave it to her. She looked at it. She looked at the seat. She handed it back. "This is your seat," she said. 2B, right here." Victor did not sit down. He stood with his carry-on beside him, and his hands loose at his sides, and looked at 2A the way a person looks at a bill they intend to dispute. Naomi had not moved. She had not looked up. She was reading about the hemodynamics of cerebrovascular occlusion, and her face was calm, and her coffee was ordered, and her boarding pass was already in the seat pocket in front of her. In the third row, a man in a charcoal suit lowered his newspaper. Gabriel Ross was 49, a corporate attorney out of a midtown firm with a practice that had taken him through 2 decades of watching powerful people behave badly in controlled environments. He had a particular gift for reading rooms. He read this one in about 4 seconds. He watched Victor. He watched Naomi. He watched Olivia, whose smile had not moved, but whose eyes had gone very steady. Naomi still had not looked up. The question settled into the cabin, like weather. Who is this woman? Why isn't she reacting? What does she know that he doesn't? Victor leaned slightly toward Olivia and said, his voice dropping just low enough to be private and just loud enough to carry to the first 2 rows, "I'd prefer to be moved. I have certain expectations for this cabin." Olivia's smile did not move, not a millimeter. She had been a flight attendant for 11 years, and she had learned in her 2nd year that the smile was not for the passenger. The smile was for her. It was the thing that kept her voice level and her hands steady and her words professional when every instinct told her to do something else entirely. "The flight is completely full," she said. "First class is at capacity. There are no available seats in any cabin." Victor looked at her the way a man looks at a door that is supposed to open automatically and hasn't, not angry, recalibrating. "Surely there's a solution," he said. His tone was patient, the patience of someone who considered patience a form of generosity. "I'm a Platinum Global member. I travel this route 12 times a year." Olivia gestured towards seat 2B. The seat was ready. The headrest cover was crisp. The space was identical in every measurable way to 2A. She said, "I understand, Mr. Zhao, and I appreciate your loyalty to American. This is your seat and will take excellent care of you right here." Victor looked at 2B. He looked at Naomi. He picked up his carry-on and placed it in the overhead bin with the precise, controlled movements of a man who had decided to accept a situation he had not approved of. He sat down. He adjusted his jacket. He said nothing for 40 seconds. Then he flagged Olivia as she moved back toward the galley. He spoke at a volume that was not quite private, not the volume of a man who wanted to be discreet, the volume of a man who had stopped trying. "I simply expected a different passenger profile in this cabin," he said. "I'm sure you understand." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. In row 3, Gabriel Ross's newspaper dropped exactly 1 inch. His eyes came up over the top of the page and stayed there. In row 4, a woman with a laptop looked up from her screen. She did not look at Victor. She looked at Naomi. Olivia's expression did not change. Later, she would not be able to say exactly what she felt in that moment, because there were too many things at once, and none of them were appropriate for the forward cabin of a commercial aircraft. She said, "We're very glad to have you with us today," and she turned and walked back toward the galley, with her shoulders straight and her jaw tight. Naomi's hand had gone completely still. She was holding the journal open to page 214. Her index finger rested on a diagram of the circle of Willis, the arterial ring at the base of the brain that keeps blood moving through the places that control language and memory and movement. She had memorized this diagram in her first year of medical school. She had taught it to residents for 15 years. Her finger rested on it now and did not move. She did not look up. She had heard this before. Not these exact words. The words changed depending on the room and the decade and the level of education of the person speaking them. In medical school, it had been a classmate who said he was surprised she had gotten in, that the program had really broadened its criteria lately. In her residency, it had been an attending who introduced her to a patient's family as the assistant before correcting himself slowly, without apology. In hospital boardrooms, it had been the particular silence that fell when she walked in before anyone knew who she was. The way chairs shifted, the way assumptions arranged themselves before she had spoken a word. She had learned the math of it a long time ago. Reacting publicly cost more than it earned, not because her anger was wrong, because her anger would become the story, and she had not come this far to become someone else's story. She turned the page. Her face gave nothing away, not the tightening around her eyes or the single slow breath she took through her nose. Nothing. Victor, satisfied by the silence, opened his laptop. He settled in with the particular ease of a man who has resolved a situation by outlasting it. He pulled reading glasses from his breast pocket, put them on, and glanced to his left with the peripheral awareness of someone confirming a decision they've already made. His eyes moved across the bag on Naomi's tray table and stopped for a moment on the cover of the journal. Cerebrovascular Disease Advanced Clinical Practice. He looked at it the way a person looks at a costume piece, a prop selected to suggest a life rather than document one. He made a sound barely audible, something that lived in the space between amusement and dismissal. He said it to no one, to the middle distance, to the air in front of his open laptop screen. Medical textbooks in first class. How ambitious. Gabriel Ross put his newspaper down completely. He set it on his tray table and folded his hands on top of it and looked at the back of Victor's seat for a moment. Then he looked at Naomi. Naomi closed the journal. She set it on her tray table with the same unhurried motion she had used to open it. She folded her hands. She looked at Victor Zhao for the first time since he had sat down beside her, a full, direct look, the kind that does not ask for anything and does not offer apology and does not perform outrage. It was the look of a person who has arrived somewhere and knows exactly where she is. It lasted 4 seconds. Victor felt it. He did not understand what it was, but he felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before you understand that the weather has shifted. He looked away first, back to his laptop. He adjusted his reading glasses. Naomi picked up her coffee. When Olivia returned with the pre-departure beverage service, she placed Naomi's order first. She set the coffee down and made eye contact for just a moment, a small, deliberate acknowledgement that cost her nothing professionally and meant everything personally. Naomi gave a single quiet nod. Victor did not acknowledge Olivia when she reached his side. He waited until she was placing his drink and then said, without looking up from his screen, that his bag in the overhead was blocking his briefcase and could she rearrange it. She did. He asked her to adjust the air vent 2 inches to the right. She did. Then he paused as though a thought had just occurred to him and asked whether the passenger in 2A had been reminded of the noise guidelines for this cabin, as he had some important work to complete and preferred a quiet environment. Olivia said she would make note of that. She turned and walked back toward the galley. The muscles along her jaw were working. Gabriel Ross watched her go. He had spent 24 years practicing law, and 19 of those years had been split between corporate litigation and civil rights cases. He had taken 22 cases involving workplace discrimination, public accommodation violations, and what he privately called the quiet kind, the bias that arrives in a blazer and uses words like profile and expectations, and merit to mean something it would never say plainly. He knew exactly what he was watching. He considered saying something. He turned the idea over for a moment, weighing it, running the calculation that lawyers run. He decided to wait, not because it wasn't worth saying, because he understood that the story was not finished, and that a lawyer who speaks too early sometimes changes what he is able to later prove. He picked up his pen instead. He opened the notes application on his phone. He began to type slowly and precisely the way he wrote depositions. The boarding door sealed. The jet bridge retracted. The aircraft began its slow push back from the gate. Victor, settling into his seat with his laptop open and his bourbon ordered and his version of events fully assembled, made one final remark. He directed it at no one in particular, at the general architecture of the first-class cabin, at the idea of the thing. "I do think airlines have gotten rather democratic with their upgrade policies," he said. He said it the way people say things they believe are observations rather than opinions. A woman 2 rows back looked up. A man across the aisle pressed his lips together. Gabriel typed one more line into his phone. Naomi reached into her bag and pulled her journal back out. She opened it to a page near the back, a page with a dog-eared corner she had folded down herself weeks ago. The page header read in plain clinical font, "Rapid recognition of acute ischemic stroke in high-altitude environments." She smoothed the page with her palm and began to read. The wheels left the ground at 7:31 a.m. New York fell away beneath the clouds in pieces, first the geometry of the terminals, then the gray sprawl of Queens, then the thin silver line of the East River, and then nothing but white. The cabin settled into the particular silence of a flight that has committed itself to the air. Seatbelt signs dimmed, passengers shifted. The sounds of the city stopped existing. Naomi opened her laptop. She worked the way she always worked, without performance, without announcement. She pulled up the file for her keynote presentation and moved through the slides, methodically adding a sentence here, sharpening a transition there, inserting a new case study into the 3rd section that her department chief had flagged in a note 2 days ago. The presentation was 71 slides. She knew every one of them. She was making them better anyway because that was the standard she held herself to. Not good enough, not ready enough, but the best she could make it with the time she had. Between slides, she checked her email. 3 messages from her department chief at Cedars-Sinai. One from a resident asking a clinical question about a patient she had seen before leaving. One from the conference coordinator confirming her arrival hotel. She answered the resident first, a detailed, careful response that took 6 minutes to write because the patient's situation warranted 6 minutes, and the resident deserved a real answer. Then she answered the coordinator. Then she opened the department chief's messages and drafted a reply she would send when the Wi-Fi stabilized. Every action was ordinary. Every action was a document. Across the armrest, Victor Zhao's first hour in the air was louder than the engine noise. He made 3 calls before the flight attendant reminded him that the aircraft was now in full flight mode. He conducted each call in a clipped, impatient register that carried easily through the front rows. Something about a Shanghai server contract. Something about a board meeting being moved. Something about a person named either Davis or Davies who had apparently done something unforgivable with a quarterly projection. He closed each call by telling the other person to handle it and clicking off before they could respond. When the Wi-Fi loaded slowly, he exhaled through his teeth and said audibly that it was unconscionable that a premium fare flight still couldn't provide reliable connectivity in the year they were currently in. His assistant seated across the aisle in 2C looked over and said nothing. She had learned when to speak. Naomi put in one earbud and kept working. Somewhere over western Pennsylvania, she stood and moved toward the forward lavatory. She stepped inside, closed the door, and stood in the small, bright space with both hands on the edge of the sink. It was not rage. She wanted to be clear with herself about that the way she was always precise about what something actually was. It was not rage, and it was not grief, and it was not the sharp clarifying thing that sometimes came with injustice and made you feel certain and alive. It was something older and quieter than any of those. It was the specific exhaustion of a person who has been performing composure for so long that the performance has become its own kind of labor. She had been doing this since she was 22 years old. In her first year of medical school at Johns Hopkins, a classmate had told her over study materials that the program had really started prioritizing diversity in admissions, said it with a kind of cheerful candor, as though he was sharing useful information. She had smiled and said nothing and gone home and studied for 4 more hours. In her residency, an attending had introduced her to a patient's family as the assistant, and then when corrected, had looked at her with an expression that was not quite apology, not quite surprise, something in between, that didn't have a clean name. She had nodded and moved on and done her work. In boardrooms and on panels and at conferences and in the hallways of hospitals, where she had practiced for 20 years, there had been 1,000 small versions of the same moment. The pause, the recalibration, the polished sentence that meant something. It would never say plainly. She had absorbed all of it, because the alternative was to become the story, and she had not spent 20 years building something real in order to hand it over to someone else's narrative about who she was allowed to be. She looked at her reflection in the lavatory mirror. Brown skin, curls still neat, glasses slightly smudged on the left lens, navy blazer with the Cedar Sinai pin on the lapel. She straightened the blazer. She cleaned the lens with the edge of her sleeve. She took one slow breath. Then she opened the door. On her way back through the galley, Olivia was restocking the beverage cart. They were briefly alone in the narrow space between the galley curtain and the cabin wall. Olivia looked up, and something moved across her face that was not the professional expression she had been wearing all morning. She said quietly, "I'm sorry about earlier. That was completely unacceptable." Naomi looked at her for a moment. She said, "You handled it well. It wasn't your mistake to fix." Olivia paused with a small bottle of sparkling water in her hand. She looked at Naomi the way a person looks when they are revising something, when a detail they had accepted without examining is suddenly asking to be examined. She nodded once slowly. Naomi went back to her seat. The flight crossed into the Midwest, and the clouds below thinned, and through the window, Kansas appeared flat and tan and enormous, stitched with the circular patterns of center pivot irrigation systems that looked from this altitude like green coins scattered across a table. Naomi returned to her presentation. Outside, the country continued. 90 minutes into the flight, Victor Zhao ordered his third bourbon. His assistant noticed. She leaned slightly forward in 2C and watched him with the careful neutrality of someone who has noticed something and is not yet sure what to do with it. Victor was on a call he had routed through the aircraft's satellite phone, speaking in a lower register than usual. His words were precise, but the rhythm was slightly off the cadence, coming a half beat slower than his earlier calls, as though the words were taking a moment longer to arrive. He rubbed the back of his neck with his right hand. Then he did it again. He caught Olivia as she passed and asked her to dim the overhead light above his seat. He said it was giving him a headache. She adjusted it. He put his reading glasses on and then took them off again and set them on the tray table. He blinked, once slowly, then again. His assistant was watching him now, with both hands folded on her knees. Naomi's phone buzzed on her tray table, a notification from the clinical monitoring app she used to track alerts from her hospital's stroke response system. She glanced at the screen out of reflex and then set it face down. She looked up. Her eyes moved to Victor, the way a compass needle moves to north, not a decision, just a direction. She watched him for 3 seconds without moving, the neck rub, the slow blink. The bourbon glass sitting untouched now, after he had ordered it with such deliberate intention 20 minutes ago. The overhead light that was suddenly too bright for a man who had spent the morning in a brightly lit airport lounge without complaint. Something inside her, the part that had been trained over 2 decades to read bodies, the way other people read text, registered what it was seeing, and quietly began to take inventory. She returned to her laptop, but she did not put the earbud back in. Gabriel Ross had been watching the front row for the better part of an hour. He had long since put down both his newspaper and his phone, and he was doing the thing he did in courtrooms when he was trying to understand something, watching without appearing to watch, building a picture from peripheral information. He had noticed Naomi noticing Victor. He did not know what she was seeing, but he recognized the quality of the attention. It was not casual. It was not hostility. It was the focused, unhurried surveillance of someone who was looking for something specific and was patient enough to wait for it. He thought she's watching him the way I watch opposing counsel when I think they're about to make a mistake they don't know they're making. Victor's hand came down on the armrest. Not a gesture, a grip, the kind that comes when a body is suddenly trying to locate itself in space. He turned his head toward Naomi slowly, with the effortful deliberateness of a man whose neck has stopped cooperating fully. And when he spoke, his voice was different, thinner. The confidence had gone out of it the way air goes out of a room. "Is it?" he said, and then paused, and then said, "Warm in here." Naomi looked at him directly. She set down her pen. She looked at his face, at the slight asymmetry that had not been there an hour ago, at the way his left hand was resting on the armrest, with the fingers slightly curled and not moving, at the particular quality of his confusion, which was not the confusion of a man who is tired or had too much to drink, but the confusion of a man whose brain is being asked to do something it is suddenly struggling to do. She said, "How long have you had that headache?" Victor stared at her, his mouth opened slightly. He had not told her about the headache. He had not told anyone about the headache. Victor's mouth opened and then closed. His eyes moved across her face with the slow, searching quality of a man trying to find solid ground in a room that has started to tilt. The headache had begun over Ohio. He had noted it the way he noted minor inconveniences briefly, with the intention of addressing it later when there was time. It had been pressure at first behind his right eye, the kind that came with long flights and too much screen time and not enough sleep. He had taken 2 ibuprofen from his jacket pocket somewhere over Indiana and washed them down with the second bourbon, and had not mentioned it to anyone because mentioning it would have required acknowledging it, and Victor Zhao had not built $8 billion by acknowledging inconveniences. But the pressure had changed. Somewhere over the western edge of Kansas, it had deepened and moved no longer behind the eye, but filling the entire right side of his skull, a dense, insistent weight that was unlike any headache he had experienced before. Different in quality. Different in the way it simply sat there immovable, as though something inside his head had changed its architecture. Naomi watched his face for 3 more seconds, and then she stood. She did not rush. Rushing was for people who did not know what they were doing. She moved with the particular economy of someone for whom emergency was not an exception, but a condition she had trained to inhabit, and she turned toward the galley and called Olivia's name in a voice that carried the full length of the forward cabin without being raised. Olivia appeared at the galley curtain. Naomi said, "I need you here now, and I need to know if there is an AED and an emergency medical kit on this aircraft." The cabin went still in the way that cabins go still when something has shifted from inconvenience to consequence. The man in row 4 stopped typing. The woman across the aisle looked up from her magazine. Gabriel Ross sat forward in his seat. Olivia stood for half a second with the galley curtain in her hand, and in that half second, something moved across her face that was fast and private, and then gone. Then she moved. She was already reaching for the emergency equipment locker as she said, "Yes, we have both. Where do you need them?" Naomi was already kneeling beside Victor. She had 2 fingers on the inside of his left wrist, her other hand resting lightly on his forearm, and she was looking directly into his face from a distance of about 18 inches. Her voice when she spoke to him was different from every other voice he had heard in his 63 years. It was not the voice of someone trying to reassure him, not the voice of someone performing calm. It was the voice of someone who was already somewhere past the beginning of the problem and working steadily toward its resolution. She said, "Victor, I need you to look at me. Can you tell me your full name?" Victor said his name. It came out correctly, but slowly, the syllables arriving with effort the way words arrive when the mechanism that produces them is working against resistance it does not usually encounter. Naomi noted it. She noted the slight asymmetry in his face, the left corner of his mouth sitting marginally lower than the right. A difference of perhaps 3 millimeters that would be invisible to anyone not looking for it. She noted the bourbon glass on his tray table, which had slipped from his left hand 2 minutes ago and landed without spilling because the tray table edge had caught it, a small piece of luck neither of them had registered at the time, but which she had seen and filed. She noted that his left hand was resting in his lap, with the fingers loosely open, unengaged, while his right hand was gripping the armrest. In her mind, she was building a picture with the speed and precision of someone who had done this in hospital corridors and emergency bays, and once in a parking structure, after a colleague collapsed at a conference in Chicago. Onset time, approximately 90 minutes progressive. Unilateral facial droop, left side. Left arm weakness, speech intact but effortful. Severe headache with sudden onset. History of hypertension and chronic vascular stress probable. 3rd bourbon on a cross-country flight at altitude. She knew what this was. From the rear of the aircraft, Olivia's voice came over the intercom professional and leveled the voice of someone delivering important information without manufacturing panic. If there is a medical professional on board, please identify yourself to the forward cabin crew immediately. 2 people responded. From somewhere in row 14, a man stood and called out that he was a dentist. From row 22, a woman was already moving up the aisle saying she was a registered nurse. Where did they need her? Naomi did not raise her hand. She was already working. The dentist reached the first-class cabin, first a compact man in his late 40s, who moved quickly and arrived with the eager, slightly uncertain energy of someone prepared to help, but not entirely sure with what. He stopped when he saw Naomi. He stood at the edge of row 2 and watched her hands watch the way she was assessing Victor's pupils with a small penlight she had retrieved from the medical kit, without pausing in her verbal assessment of his symptoms. Watched the way she positioned her fingers along his jaw to check muscle response, and something in his expression shifted from readiness to recognition. He turned to Olivia and said quietly, but not quietly enough she knows what she's doing. She knows exactly what she's doing. Olivia looked at Naomi and said nothing. The nurse arrived. Naomi looked up briefly and said, "I need you to take his blood pressure with the cuff in the kit and read it to me every 2 minutes. Don't interpret it, just read the numbers." The nurse said yes and opened the kit and began. Naomi said to Olivia, "Aspirin 325 milligrams and oxygen from the portable unit, flow rate at 4 liters per minute." Olivia already had both in her hands. Naomi looked across the aisle at Gabriel Ross, a direct look that lasted less than 2 seconds, but contained a complete instruction. She said, "Can you make sure no one from the back cabin comes forward? Keep the aisle clear." Gabriel was already standing. He said yes the way lawyers say yes when they understand exactly what they have been asked to do and why. Then Naomi turned to Olivia and said, "Get the captain. Tell him we need priority landing clearance. Tell him I believe this is an acute ischemic event. Tell him time matters." Olivia moved to the forward phone. The first-class cabin had become a different place than it had been 20 minutes ago. The people in it had been rearranged into a new order, not by rank or fare class or the size of their companies, but by function, by what they could do in this specific moment. And at the center of the new order was a woman in a navy blazer who had been questioned about whether she belonged here, kneeling in the aisle of a commercial aircraft. Keeping a billionaire alive with equipment designed for exactly this contingency and knowledge that no piece of equipment could replace. Victor was still semi-conscious. His eyes tracked Naomi's face with the slow, effortful focus of someone who was trying very hard to stay present in a moment that keeps threatening to dissolve. His voice when it came was thin and frightened, stripped of everything that had been in it that morning, the authority, the polish, the elaborate architecture of a man who had never needed to ask for anything. He said what is, and then stopped, and then tried again. "What is happening to me?" Naomi looked at him steadily. She said it plainly without hesitation, without anything in her voice except the truth and the intention to act on it. "You're having a stroke," she said. "I'm a neurologist. I'm going to take care of you." She said it without irony. She had none to spare. She said it without satisfaction, because there was nothing satisfying about a human being in crisis. And she had never once in her career felt anything other than the urgent total focus of someone who understood that the next few minutes were the ones that would determine what the rest of his life looked like. She meant every word. Victor's eyes changed. It happened the way things happen when a person understands something they cannot undo all at once, in layers, the information arriving faster than the capacity to process it. He looked at her face, at the precise, unfrightened attention of a woman who had been dismissed and questioned and made to feel like a passenger who did not belong, and who was now without ceremony or condition, the only thing standing between him and catastrophe. Something moved through his expression. Recognition. Horror. A shame so complete it had nowhere to go. The intercom clicked. Captain Andrew Sullivan's voice filled the cabin, measured and direct the voice of a man who had declared emergencies before, and understood that the job of the voice in that moment was to inform without escalating. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we have a medical situation on board. We are declaring a medical emergency and have been granted priority landing at Denver International Airport. We will be on the ground in approximately 22 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Our crew is attending to the situation." The intercom clicked off. 22 minutes. Victor's right hand moved from the armrest. It found Naomi's wrist, the wrist of the hand she had resting on his forearm, and it closed around it, not to stop her, not to push her away. His grip was the grip of a man holding on to the only solid thing in a room that has lost its floor. Naomi did not pull back. She let him hold on, and she kept working. Across the aisle, Gabriel Ross sat back down, slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He did not open the camera. He opened the notes application and began to type his thumbs, moving steadily across the screen. Each sentence time-stamped each detail, recorded with the particular care of a man who has spent his career understanding that some moments need to be preserved exactly as they happened before memory has a chance to soften their edges. 22 minutes is not a long time in most circumstances. It is a long time when a man's brain is being deprived of blood, and the only thing between him and permanent damage is a woman kneeling in the aisle of a pressurized aircraft at 35,000 feet with a portable oxygen kit and 20 years of clinical training. Naomi worked without stopping. She kept one hand on Victor's forearm and monitored his responsiveness every 90 seconds, asking him to squeeze her fingers, asking him to follow her penlight, asking him to tell her his name, not because she had forgotten it, but because the answers told her things the equipment could not. The nurse read blood pressure numbers every 2 minutes, steady and reliable, and Naomi processed each one without comment. Adjusting the oxygen flow once when the numbers shifted in a direction, she did not like making a small correction, with the particular calm of someone who has learned that calm is itself a clinical tool. Victor deteriorated and came back in waves. There were minutes when his eyes were focused and his right hand gripped the armrest with purpose, and he seemed to be tracking everything around him with something close to comprehension. There were other minutes when his gaze drifted toward the window, and the grip loosened and his breathing changed, quality becoming slower and more effortful, and Naomi would bring him back with her voice speaking directly into his face, saying his name, saying, "Stay with me," saying, "I need you to look at me right now." He always came back. Each time took slightly more effort. The other passengers in first class had gone very quiet. The man who had been typing had not typed a word in 15 minutes. The woman in row 4 who had looked up from her laptop when Victor made his comment about passenger profiles had not looked back down. A man in row 5, silver-haired, and wearing the kind of suit that suggested a corner office was watching Naomi, with an expression that was difficult to name, something between disbelief and a shame that had nowhere to aim itself. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved unnecessarily. The forward cabin had organized itself around what was happening in row 2, the way rooms organize themselves around the thing that actually matters. They were watching a black woman in a navy blazer keep a billionaire alive with her bare hands and a portable oxygen kit. Nobody said this out loud. Nobody needed to. Victor's assistant had been pressed against the forward bulkhead since the moment Naomi stood up. He was 27 years old and had spent 3 years managing Victor Zhao's calendar, his travel, his correspondence, his preferences regarding hotel thread counts and car service temperatures, and the exact brand of sparkling water he required at business dinners. He was very good at his job. He had no preparation for this. He leaned toward Olivia and said in a low, rapid voice, "Should we call his doctor? He has a personal physician in San Francisco. Dr. Lim, he's on retainer, if we could reach him by phone. He might be able to advise on." Naomi said, without looking up from Victor, "His personal physician is not on this plane. I am. I need you to be quiet and stay out of my way." The assistant sat down. He sat down the way people sit down when they have understood something completely and have no response to it. He pressed his back against the bulkhead and put both hands on his knees and did not speak again. Olivia was moving between the galley and row 2 with the controlled efficiency of someone running on training and adrenaline in equal measure. She passed Gabriel Ross on one of her passes, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second, just long enough for something to be exchanged that did not require words and did not need them. This man told her she didn't belong here. She is the only reason he is still breathing. Gabriel held her gaze for that fraction of a second and then looked back at row 2. His phone was in his hand. He was still typing. 14 minutes out from Denver, Victor had a window of clarity. His eyes came into focus and found Naomi's face, and he looked at her with the specific attention of a man who is aware that he may not have many more moments of complete consciousness and is trying to use this one honestly. His mouth moved, The words came out broken, incomplete, arriving in pieces the way words arrive when the brain is working harder than usual to produce them. He said, "I didn't." And then he stopped. And then he tried again. "I didn't know." Naomi looked at him. Her expression did not change. She said, "Don't try to talk. Save your strength." She said it without hardness. She said it the way she said everything in that cabin, with the total focus of a clinician who has set aside every personal consideration, because the only thing that exists right now is the work. She was not saving him for the apology. She was not waiting to hear what he hadn't known. She was saving him because he was a human being in front of her who needed saving, and that had always been since her first year of medical school. Since her first rotation in the stroke unit at Johns Hopkins, since the first patient she had ever pulled back from the edge of permanent damage, the only reason she needed. This was who she was. This was who she had always been. The Rocky Mountains appeared below the window, gray and white and enormous, indifferent to everything happening in the pressurized cabin above them. Through the porthole on the opposite side of the aircraft, the flat brown sprawl of Denver was becoming visible at the edge of the horizon, and then the runways of Denver International, and then the small, bright shapes of emergency vehicles, positioned along the tarmac lights already rotating. Captain Sullivan began his descent. The aircraft tilted forward by a degree that was barely perceptible, but that every person in the cabin felt the particular sensation of a flight that is ending sooner than scheduled, and Olivia moved through the cabin, confirming seatbelts, confirming tray tables, confirming that the nurse was secured, and the medical kit was stabilized, and that Naomi had what she needed for the next 11 minutes. Naomi had not left row 2 in over an hour. She had not eaten. She had not checked her phone. She had not thought about the keynote or the conference or the hotel room in Los Angeles or the 1,200 neurologists waiting to hear her speak in less than 24 hours. She had not thought about the morning, about the lounge, about the man who had said he expected a different passenger profile, about the way the word ambitious had landed in the cabin like something thrown. She thought about the clock inside Victor's brain. Every stroke is a race between damage and intervention. Every minute of untreated acute ischemia costs the brain approximately 1.9 million neurons. She knew this the way she knew her own name. She had put this number in presentations and published it in papers and said it to rooms full of physicians who needed to understand that time was not a resource in stroke management. It was the variable that determined everything. The clock had started approximately 97 minutes ago over western Kansas. She had been working against it since minute 92. 5 minutes mattered, 2 minutes mattered, 30 seconds mattered. The wheels touched the runway at Denver International with a controlled thud that moved through the cabin floor and into the seat frames and into the soles of everyone's feet. The engines reversed. The aircraft slowed. Outside the window, the emergency vehicles were moving, pacing the plane along the taxiway with their lights going, and when the aircraft stopped and the door seal released, there were paramedics at the threshold before the door had fully opened. Naomi stood and met them at the entrance to the cabin. She spoke for 90 seconds without stopping, and in those 90 seconds she gave them everything on set, time estimated at approximately 97 minutes prior to landing progressive presentation. Initial symptoms, including unilateral cephalic pressure, left side facial asymmetry, left arm motor deficit, and effortful speech interventions, including supplemental oxygen at 4 liters per minute, and 325 milligrams of aspirin administered at the 22-minute mark. Current blood pressure readings from the past 14 minutes. Current neurological responsiveness status, and her clinical assessment of stroke classification. The lead paramedic was a woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried authority of someone who had run thousands of calls and been surprised by very few of them. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When Naomi finished, she said, "Are you a physician?" Naomi said, "Neurologist, stroke specialist." The paramedic looked at her for 1 second, with the particular expression of one expert acknowledging another, a look that contains no surprise and no performance, just the clean recognition of competence. She nodded once and turned to direct her team. The stretcher came through the door. Victor was moved onto it with practiced efficiency, 2 paramedics working in the coordinated silence of people who have done this together before. An oxygen mask went over his face. A monitoring lead went on his wrist. The stretcher locked into position. As they rolled him toward the exit, his right arm slipped from the side rail where he had been gripping it. His hand fell open and came to rest against the edge of the stretcher, palm up, fingers loose. His sleeve had ridden up during the transfer. The Patek Philippe watch was on his left wrist, the one that had gone weak first, the one that had dropped the bourbon glass. The crystal face was cracked a single fracture line running from the 11 to the 4, the kind of damage that happens when a wrist hits the edge of a hard surface with the dead weight of a limb that is no longer responding to its owner's instructions. The watch had probably cracked during those first minutes when his arm failed and no one had noticed, because there had been more urgent things to notice. Nobody on the aircraft remarked on it. The stretcher moved through the door. The paramedics moved with it. Victor Zhao disappeared from the cabin he had entered 3 hours ago as though he owned the air in it. The most expensive thing about him was broken. He had been saved by the woman he had tried to make invisible. The passengers came off the plane in a different order than they had boarded. Not physically. Physically, they moved through the jet bridge in the usual single-file procession, pulling carry-ons, checking phones, adjusting straps. But something had shifted in the architecture of the group. The people who had boarded as separate self-contained units of status and schedule had been reorganized by the last 90 minutes into something more complicated. They moved quietly. They did not make eye contact easily. Several of them had the particular look of people who are processing something they have not yet found words for. The gate area at Denver International was bright and loud in the way that airport gate areas always are indifferent to whatever has just happened on any given aircraft. Departure boards flickered. A child was crying somewhere near the newsstand. An announcement for a Phoenix flight came over the public address system at full volume. The passengers from the diverted flight gathered near their gate in clusters, some on phones, some sitting, some standing with their bags at their feet and their eyes on the middle distance. Several had opened social media before the jet bridge door had fully closed behind them. They were not sure what they had witnessed. They were sure they had witnessed something. Olivia Hart sat on a bench inside the jet bridge, still in uniform, with the door to the gate area propped open behind her. She was not on duty anymore. The aircraft had been handed to the ground crew, and the medical situation had been transferred to the paramedics, and her professional obligations for this flight had technically concluded. She sat with her phone in both hands and opened the notes application. She did not write for anyone. She wrote the way people write when they need to put something outside of themselves before they can understand it. She wrote what she had seen from the moment Victor Zhao paused at row 2 to the moment the stretcher left the aircraft. She wrote it in order with detail the way she had been trained to write incident reports because she understood somewhere, without articulating it, that this was a document and documents needed to be accurate. When she finished, she read it back once. She did not post it. She saved it and put her phone in her jacket pocket and sat for another minute looking at the floor of the jet bridge before she stood up. At the gate, Gabriel Ross had his phone to his ear before he reached the first row of seats. His law partner answered on the second ring. Gabriel said, "I just witnessed something on a plane." He paused. "I'm going to need to think carefully about what to do with it." His partner asked what kind of something. Gabriel looked across the gate area toward the window, where the diverted aircraft was still visible on the tarmac, surrounded by ground vehicles. He said the kind that has legal, ethical, and public dimensions and needs to be handled in the right order. His partner said, "That sounds like a long flight story." Gabriel said it became one. He said he would call back when he had more time, and clicked off. He sat down. He opened his notes. He kept writing. Naomi was standing near the gate windows when Leonard Hayes found her. He was 60, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped white hair, and the kind of face that had spent decades at the front of lecture halls and boardrooms, and was comfortable with being looked at. He was wearing a conference lanyard over a charcoal blazer, and he was moving through the crowd with the directed purpose of a man who has received alarming information and is verifying it in person. He saw her, and his pace increased, and when he reached her, he took both of her hands in his and held them. He said, "Naomi." My God. He said it the way people say things when the formal version of their feelings has been overtaken by the actual version. "We heard there was a medical emergency," he said. Someone from the conference staff was on a connecting flight and saw the diverted aircraft and the emergency vehicles and called ahead. Someone said a neurologist intervened. He shook his head slightly. "I had no idea it was you. Are you all right?" Naomi said she was fine. She said it with the same economy she used for everything, meaning it completely, not minimizing it, just not requiring more words than the situation called for. 5 feet away, Victor's assistant was standing with his phone in his hand, facing the window, waiting for an update from the hospital. He had not moved since reaching the gate. He heard Leonard Hayes' voice. He did not turn around immediately, but he heard every word. Leonard was still holding Naomi's hands. He turned slightly, not performing anything, just moved by what he was feeling, and he spoke to the small, loose gathering of passengers who were still near the gate, stranded waiting for rebooked flights, standing with their luggage in the particular aimless way of travelers whose plans have been interrupted. He spoke loudly enough that the words carried clearly across the space between them. He said, "I want you to know who helped you today." He nodded toward Naomi. "You're looking at one of the most respected stroke specialists in the United States. She is the keynote speaker at the National Neurological Sciences Conference. She has probably saved more lives than anyone standing in this airport right now." The gate area went quiet in the specific way that public spaces go quiet when something true has been said in them. People looked at Naomi. People looked at each other. The silver-haired executive from row 5, who had been watching her work in the cabin, was standing 6 feet away with his roller bag beside him, and he looked at her now, with an expression that had no performance in it at all. The woman who had looked up from her laptop in row 4 had her hand over her mouth. Someone near the back of the small crowd, a man in a window seat jacket from row 11, whom nobody had spoken to during the flight, said it quietly. Not to anyone in particular, just to the air in front of him, the way people say things when they are simply completing a thought. She was the one sitting next to him. Nobody responded, the words sat in the space, and the space held them. Victor's assistant turned away from the window. His face had the drained, reconfigured quality of someone who has understood something they cannot ununderstand. He walked to a seat at the far edge of the gate area, sat down and made a phone call. The person who answered was Victor's board liaison in San Francisco, a man named Richard Park, who managed the American operations of Victor's company, and who was paid, among other things, to receive difficult information calmly. The assistant told him what had happened. He told him about the boarding, about the comments Victor had made regarding the passenger in 2A, about the emergency, about who the woman in 2A actually was. He told it in order without editorializing, because there was no editorializing required. The facts were sufficient. Richard Park said nothing for 4 seconds. Then he said, "Does he know?" The assistant said he was unconscious when they told him. He said the paramedics had relayed the information to the hospital team during handoff, but that Victor had been non-responsive at that point and had not reacted. Richard Park said he'll know when he wakes up. Then he said, "I'll make some calls." Then he ended the call. The 17-second clip appeared on social media at 1:14 in the afternoon, posted by a woman named Dana Okafor, who had been sitting in row 14 and who had been recording a casual travel vlog for her 34,000 followers on TikTok when the incident in first class had become audible through the cabin. The clip contained 2 sounds. The first was Victor's voice, clear and unhurried, saying he simply expected a different passenger profile in this cabin. The second, from later in the flight, was Naomi's voice, commanding and precise, saying, "Get the captain. Tell him we need priority landing clearance. Tell him, I believe this is an acute ischemic event." The clip was 17 seconds long. It did not show faces. It did not provide context. It did not need to. By 4 p.m., it had 400,000 views. By 6 p.m., it had crossed 1 million. Medical professionals shared it with the caption of "someone who actually saves lives." Civil rights attorneys shared it with no caption at all. Corporate diversity consultants shared it with long paragraphs that nobody finished reading. On Black Twitter, the response was not surprise. The response was the exhausted, clear-eyed recognition of people who already knew this story because they had lived versions of it, and who were watching it play out in public with the particular attention of those for whom representation in a viral clip is not entertainment but documentation. The comments filled with phrases like "this is one of the most touching stories I've seen this year," and "real-life stories hit different when they're actually true," and "she saved the man who said she didn't belong there." Naomi did not see any of it. She had called her department chief at Cedars-Sinai from the gate to explain the delay. She had called the conference coordinator to confirm she would be at the venue by 7:30 the following morning for an 8 a.m. keynote. She had booked a room at the Westin Denver International using the hotel app on her phone, and she had taken a shuttle from the terminal and checked in and ordered a grilled chicken sandwich and a pot of tea from room service and eaten at the desk while reviewing the last 15 slides of her presentation. She was asleep by 9. At Denver Health Medical Center, the attending cardiologist completed his evening rounds at 11:47 p.m. and stopped at the room where Victor Zhao had been stable for the past 4 hours. Victor was awake. The CT had confirmed an acute ischemic stroke involving the right middle cerebral artery territory, caught within the therapeutic window. The treatment team was cautiously optimistic about the prognosis. Rehabilitation would be required. The outcome, relative to what it could have been without early intervention, was considered favorable. The cardiologist stood at the foot of the bed and told Victor this plainly, the way cardiologists tell patients things when they want the patient to understand the full weight of a fact. He said, "Whoever intervened on that plane, the timing of their response is the reason you will walk out of this hospital." Victor said nothing for a moment. Then he asked for his phone. His assistant, sitting in the chair beside the bed, handed it over with both hands. His hands were not entirely steady. Victor looked at the screen. The clip had 2.1 million views. He pressed play. He watched the 17 seconds. He heard his own voice, first unhurried, polished, reasonable sounding, saying exactly what he had said. Then he heard hers. He set the phone face down on the hospital tray. He looked at the ceiling for a long time without speaking. Outside the window, Denver was dark and quiet, and somewhere across the city in a hotel room near the airport, the woman whose voice was in that clip was sleeping so she could be ready to take the stage in the morning. She was on a shuttle to the terminal by 6:15 in the morning. Los Angeles was 3 hours behind Denver by flight time, but the conference had not moved its schedule, and Naomi had not asked it to. She had slept 7 hours, which was more than she usually got before a keynote, and she had eaten breakfast at the hotel restaurant and reviewed her opening slides one final time over coffee, and had taken the shuttle with her bag and her journal and the same quiet composure she carried everywhere, as though the previous day had been a long one and she had rested, and now there was work to do. The flight to Los Angeles was uneventful. She read for most of it. She did not check social media. The Westin Bonaventure in downtown Los Angeles had a grand ballroom on the 4th floor that seated 1,400 people and had hosted the National Neurological Sciences Conference for 11 consecutive years. By 7:45 in the morning, it held 1,200 of them, neurologists and researchers and hospital executives and medical journalists and residents who had traveled from 31 states to be in the same room for 3 days of the most current thinking in their field. The room smelled of fresh coffee and carpet cleaner, and the particular anticipatory energy of people who do serious work and take it seriously. Leonard Hayes took the stage at 7:58. He was the chairman of the conference, and he had introduced the opening keynote speaker every year for 9 years, and he knew how to do it with precision and warmth and the correct amount of institutional authority. He spoke for 4 minutes about Naomi's career, her directorship at Cedars-Sinai, her professorship, her research publication and record, her national influence on emergency stroke protocols, her work training, the next generation of cerebrovascular specialists. He did not mention the flight. He did not mention Denver. He did not mention a man in a charcoal suit or a first-class cabin or a cracked watch face. That was not why she was here. He said her name, and 1,200 people put down their coffee cups. Naomi walked to the podium from the left side of the stage. She set her notes down, adjusted the microphone by 2 inches, and looked out at the room for a moment before she spoke. She had done this in rooms like this one many times. She knew how to hold a room from the first sentence. She knew how to make 1,200 people feel like she was talking to each one individually. She had earned that skill over 20 years of standing in front of audiences who needed to be not just informed, but moved enough to change how they practiced, how they responded, how fast they reached for the phone when a patient said their head hurt in a way it had never hurt before. She had not planned to change the opening. She had written the first line of this keynote 4 months ago and had not altered it since. But she stood at the podium in the Westin Bonaventure ballroom on a Wednesday morning, and she looked at the room, and something in her decided to say something true before she said anything prepared. She said it quietly, without drama, the way she said things when she meant them completely. "Stroke doesn't care who you are," she said. "It doesn't check your net worth, your passport, or your seat assignment. And neither do I." The room went still. Not the polite stillness of an audience waiting for the next sentence. A different kind. The kind that comes when something has been said that means more than it appears to mean, and the people in the room can sense that weight without knowing its source. 1,200 people sat in that stillness and felt it without being able to explain it. In the front row, Leonard Hayes closed his eyes for a moment, just one moment. Then he opened them and watched her work. She spoke for 71 minutes. She was brilliant and precise, and she moved through the material the way someone moves through territory they know completely, with confidence and without hesitation, and with the occasional moment of spontaneous clarity that only comes from genuine mastery. She presented 3 case studies. She introduced a new framework for pre-hospital stroke recognition that her team had been developing for 2 years. She took 4 questions from the audience at the end and answered each one with the direct, unhurried thoroughness of someone who has nothing to prove and every reason to be generous. When she finished, the room stood up. 3 days after the flight, Victor Zhao was still at Denver Health Medical Center. He was stable and improving, and the rehabilitation team had begun their initial assessment, and the prognosis, while requiring significant work, was better than it had any right to be given the circumstances. He knew this. His cardiologist had told him again, more precisely this time, what the intervention on the aircraft had meant for his outcome. He had listened without speaking. On the 3rd morning, he asked his assistant to find Naomi's professional contact information through the conference directory. His assistant did this and placed a printed sheet on the hospital tray table beside his water cup. Victor did not use the contact information immediately. He asked his assistant to also print her biography page from the conference website, the full one with her credentials and her publications and her hospital titles and her research summary. His assistant printed 4 pages and set them beside the contact sheet and left the room. Victor read all 4 pages. He read them the way he read contracts, carefully, completely, with the attention of someone who understands that every line means something. He read the degrees: Johns Hopkins for medical school, Columbia for her residency, 22 years at Cedars-Sinai, 47 published papers, principal investigator on 3 NIH-funded research studies, director of the Stroke Fellowship Program that had trained 31 physicians currently practicing across the country. He read it for a long time. When his assistant returned to check on him, Victor was looking at the window. The 4 pages were on the tray table, neatly aligned. He did not say anything about what he had read. He asked his assistant to bring him something to write with. His silence was not the silence of a man with nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who has looked at the full architecture of his assumptions and found that it cannot hold the weight of what he now knows. Gabriel Ross published his essay on LinkedIn on a Thursday afternoon, 12 days after the flight. He titled it, "What I Witnessed at 35,000 Feet." He wrote it in the measured, precise register of a man who has spent his career constructing arguments from evidence and understands the responsibility of putting something into public record. He named no one directly. He described the sequence of events, the comments, the emergency, the intervention, with the unhurried accuracy of a professional observer who was present for all of it and wrote it down while it was still happening. He ended it with a paragraph that his law partner later told him was the best thing he had ever written outside a courtroom. He wrote the same woman who was questioned about whether she belonged in that cabin spent the next 90 minutes ensuring the man who questioned her would live to question someone else. I have been a lawyer for 24 years. I have never seen a clearer demonstration of what grace under pressure actually means. The essay reached 4 million impressions in 48 hours. 3 major newspapers had contacted him for comment within 72 hours. He directed them all to the essay and said it contained everything he intended to say publicly. The airline opened a formal internal review of the incident within the week. Olivia Hart submitted her account through the crew report system, 6 pages time-stamped, detailed, written in the same private notes she had started in the jet bridge. The airline's Diversity and Inclusion Office reached out to Cedars-Sinai's Communications Department, requesting a statement from or about Dr. Bennett. Naomi declined to comment. Her hospital's communications director released a single sentence on her behalf. Dr. Bennett acted in accordance with her oath and her character. That is all she has ever done. Victor's American business expansion, a $2.3 billion telecommunications infrastructure deal that had already been under review by American regulatory partners for reasons unrelated to this incident, encountered what his board liaison described in an internal memo as significant reputational headwinds as the story moved through the business press. There were no lawsuits. There were no dramatic public hearings. There was only the slow, accumulating weight of public record doing what public record does when it is accurate and thorough and widely read. 1 month after the flight, a package arrived at Naomi's office at Cedars-Sinai, delivered through professional courier channels. Inside was an envelope sealed with her name written on the front in careful, deliberate handwriting. 3 pages, handwritten. In English, which was not Victor Zhao's first language, which meant every word had been chosen with effort. Naomi read it at her desk alone in the late afternoon, when the department had gone quiet. She read all 3 pages without stopping. Her expression as she read was not readable in the way that her expressions were often not readable, not because she was performing composure, but because she was a person who processed things inwardly and completely before deciding what they meant. When she finished, she sat for a moment with the pages in her hands. Then she folded them carefully along their original creases. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk, the one that held things she had not yet decided what to do with. She placed the letter inside. She closed the drawer. Not the trash, not a frame on the wall, a drawer. Some things are not resolved. Some things are simply held. That evening after rounds, Naomi sat at her desk with the city of Los Angeles spread out below the floor-to-ceiling windows, the last light going orange across the basin, the office quiet around her. She had a new patient file open in front of her. A 58-year-old man referred from the emergency department, presenting with transient symptoms that his primary care physician had initially attributed to fatigue. She was reading his history with the focused attention she brought to every file, because every file was a person, and every person deserved that attention. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A text from a former resident, a young woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who was now practicing in Houston, and who had trained under Naomi for 2 years, and who sent a message every few months with an update on a difficult case or a question about a patient presentation. The text said, "Saw the clip, Dr. Bennett. We're all so proud of you." Naomi looked at the message for a moment. She set the phone face down on the desk. She returned to the patient file. This was who she had been before the flight. A doctor at her desk in the evening, reading a patient's history, looking for the thing that others had missed. This was who she was now. The world had changed its opinion of her in the past 30 days. She had not changed at all. She had never needed the world's opinion to know what she was. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in seat 2, reading a journal, waiting for the moment it's actually needed. These are the real-life stories that stay with you. Not because they're dramatic, because they're true. Because somewhere right now, there is a person being dismissed and underestimated who is the only thing standing between someone else and disaster. These are the black stories, the life stories, the touching stories that remind us of something we keep having to learn and keep having to say out loud. Dignity is not something others give you. It is something they cannot take. The cracked face of a Patek Philippe watch, a single fracture line from the 11 to the 4, black screen. Dr. Naomi Bennett delivered her keynote to a standing ovation. She has never spoken publicly about the flight. If this story stayed with you, take a second to share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one about quiet strength, real dignity, and the people the world tries to overlook, stay with this channel. There are more coming.